Hi everyone, and welcome to this very special Point North one-shot presentation on The Princess Bride. I'm Alistair Stevens, and of course, I'm kind of stretching the definition of what a Point North one-shot means because this is kind of a two-shot. This is the second part of a discussion that we had previously last week discussing the 1973 novel version of William Goldman's adaptation, abridgment of the classic S. Morgenstern fairy tale, The Princess Bride. But there's just too much to talk about for a single session. So this week, we're going to take everything that we discussed last week as read. If you haven't yet listened to the first part of that discussion, you should probably go and listen to it. I had a really good time recording that session. This week, we're going to focus on the Princess Bride movie adaptation from 1987, and we're going to talk a little more about the story. Last time, we spent a lot of time discussing the fictional frame and the way that William Goldman, the real author, interacts with S. Morgenstern, the fictional author, with Bill Goldman, the kind of fictional version of William Goldman that he created, the version of the story told by William Goldman's fictional father within the frame of the book. We talked a lot about the layers of text and narrative that we were given. And we're going to talk a little about that this week too, I suppose, as we look at this fascinating framing device and look at the way that William Goldman brought his vision to the big screen with the able assistance, of course, of Rob Reiner. William Goldman wrote The Princess Bride in 1973. Rob Reiner, the director of the movie adaptation, tells a story about how his father, the famous Carl Reiner, of course, gave him a copy of Goldman's beloved novel when he was a child. That inspired him to tell stories and to spread goodness and good cheer through the world, and is, of course, completely fictional, because Rob Reiner was born in 1947 and was thus 26 when the book was released, so it is literally impossible for his father to have given him a copy of the book when he was a child. But I actually really like the way that story, that fable origin of the Princess Bride movie kind of plays into the metatextual awareness surrounding the book itself. Cary Elwes also claims to have loved the book as a child, though he was 11 when it was published, so that is at least possible. After the success of This Is Spinal Tap in 1984, a movie which I absolutely adore and would love to do a one-shot about at some point, and during production of Stand By Me in 1986, another movie that I completely adore and would love to do a one-shot about at some point, Reiner decided that he wanted to adapt The Princess Bride as his next project. He took this idea to Paramount, who said, No, we're not going to do The Princess Bride. That is a troubled production. That is no good. People have tried to do this before. And at that point, Reiner learned that, in fact, Fox had given William Goldman $500,000 back in 1973, shortly after the publication of the novel, in order to secure the movie rights. They had tried to make an adaptation which had absolutely faltered. Goldman then bought the rights back using his own money, which is all but unprecedented. He didn't pay the full $500,000 price tag, I should say, at this point, but it was still a remarkable achievement for an individual screenwriter. And then he tried to get the movie adapted for about 15 years, in fact, until Rob Reiner finally managed to persuade Paramount to take the risk on this weird movie. Goldman was hired to adapt his own screenplay. He had previously, just the previous year, in fact, adapted Heat from his own novel, which is a brilliant movie. I've never actually read the novel of Heat, but it's a knockout film. He had also, by this point, earned a reputation as a safe pair of hands for adaptation. He had adapted previously All the President's Men, Marathon Man, The Stepford Wives. He was a solid, dependable adapter of novels into screenplays, as well, of course, as being closely connected to the original text. Though I don't think I realized until this one-shot series how closely he was connected to that original text, like how fully the movie represents the book on the big screen. So much of the dialogue in this movie is taken verbatim from the pages of the novel, and when there are changes, they are almost all for the better. I should say, in fact, that here in the live chat, I have put together two quick polls. Let's take a glance at these right now. I'm not going to read out the results, I suppose, just yet. We'll do that at the end. But I have two polls. One asking, who is your favorite character in the Princess Bride movie adaptation? And whether or not you guys prefer the movie or the book version. I think I know how both of those polls are going to work out, but we'll talk about those right at the end. The movie was shot in England for a budget of $16 million and made $30 million at the box office. By contrast, the runaway success that year was a little film that had exactly the same budget, $16 million, but made $170 million at the box office. That, in 1987, was the difference between a middling commercial success and a blockbuster commercial success, right? $16 million budgets, $30 million for The Princess Bride, $170 million for Three Men and a Baby, the runaway success of 1987. And let me talk a little about 1987 in film. Can we do that for just a moment? The top 10 in 1987, in reverse order, is The Witches of Eastwick, Lethal Weapon, Stakeout, The Secret of My Success, The Untouchables, That's the Chicago Way, Moonstruck, Good Morning Vietnam, Beverly Hills Cop 2, Fatal Attraction, and Three Men and a Baby. But that is not the whole story by any means, because also released in 1987, brace yourselves, Mannequin, Evil Dead 2, Raising Arizona, Predator, Roxanne, Spaceballs, Full Metal Jacket, RoboCop, Superman 4, The Quest for Peace, Dirty Dancing, The Running Man, Planes, Trains and Automobiles, Wall Street, and Batteries Not Included, in addition to the top 10 that I just mentioned, and The Princess Bride. So, for all that it was a middling commercial success, it appeared absolutely nowhere in the end-of-year rankings because, well, the movie was just overlooked. Cary Elwes said after the fact, quote, "Initially, the studio didn't know how to market it. Was it an adventure, a fantasy, a comedy, a romance, a kids movie? In the end, they sold it as a kids movie and it largely had to rely on word of mouth. Now people tell me that they still have the VHS copy that has been passed down from one generation to the next. And that, friends, is where The Princess Bride found its audience. It was an absolute cult classic through the 1990s on primarily VHS. Now I'm sure we all own DVD and in fact Blu-ray copies, or we have copies of this film attached to every streaming service available. But those VHSs, I remember having those VHSs and lending that VHS to my friends. But at the same time, I remember all of my friends also owning VHS copies of The Princess Bride. I remember this movie being completely ubiquitous through the early 1990s. And that, I think, is why it is now as beloved as it is. I don't know anyone, and by all means, shout out in the chat if you are the exception to this rule, but I don't know anyone who has seen The Princess Bride once. I think you have either never seen The Princess Bride or you have seen it 100 times, and I am absolutely in the latter camp. I literally just finished watching it again. It is now 9:08 here in Oklahoma City, and I finished watching this movie at about 8:40, I think, this evening. And I found, much to my delight, that I can still remember not just every line of dialogue, but every quirk of intonation and delivery. I remember all of the musical cues, the musical stings. I remember so vividly and powerfully the musical stings that accompany Wesley's slaying of the ROUS in the fire swamp, right? As he stabs his sword in 3 times, and we get that brilliant string swell behind him as he does it. These things are emblazoned upon my memory in a way that really isn't replicated by any other film. The Princess Bride stands alone for me, not just in my love of the film, not just in my respect for the film, not just in my affection for all of the varied performances in the film, or in fact, the influence that the film had over me as a young man and as a developing adult, and now, I suppose, as a critic of stories and storytelling too. I don't know of another film that is this vivid in my memory. I suppose the closest thing would be Ghostbusters or some of the Star Trek movies, right? Like, I have the same kind of encyclopedic knowledge and recollection of those films, but those films still don't hang together fully, completely, in aggregate, as well as The Princess Bride does. The film was first released in the United States on September the 25th in 1987 and was well received by critics. It famously got 3.5 stars from Roger Ebert at the time, which is pretty definitive. I mean, worth a lot then and now, in fact. But it is over time that it really attracted the critical attention and popular attention that it deserved. The film is number 50 on Bravo's list of 100 funniest movies, number 88 on the AFI's 100 Years, 100 Passions, and number 46 on Channel 4's 50 Greatest Comedy Films of All Time list. Then, in 2016, the film was finally inducted into the National Film Registry, being deemed as, quote, culturally, historically, or aesthetically significant. All three, I'm sure, all three. We're going to talk a little about the cast, I'm sure, as we move through our discussion over the course of the next hour, but let's break down their origin stories coming into this film. Cary Elwes, and apparently you hit the W pretty hard in the pronunciation of his surname. Cary Elwes was cast after the success of Lady Jane, a 1986 movie about the life of Lady Jane Grey, who was played in that film by Helena Bonham Carter. That is an absolutely lovely movie, or at least is in my memory, because I probably haven't seen that movie since 1992. But I would really like to go back to it now, remembering, in fact, that it exists. But he was cast expressly off of his success in that film. He played Lord Guildford Dudley, Lady Grey's wife in that movie. Robin Wright was coming off of 538 episodes of Santa Barbara, an NBC soap opera. The Princess Bride was only her second film. Mandy Patinkin, by contrast, was already well established. He was already a Tony winner and a Golden Globe nominee before he played Inigo Montoya. And Andre the Giant, was already a giant. He was already one of the biggest wrestling superstars in the entire world. He was in 1987 concluding his 15-year undefeated tenure in the WWF. Unfortunately, Andre the Giant died in 1993. Peter Cook, who is, of course, so famous in the last movement of this film, who is credited in the last movement of this film, by the way, as the Impressive Clergyman. That is his actual name in the IMDb credits and on the script. The Impressive Clergyman. Peter Cook sadly died in 1995. It is difficult. It is nigh impossible, I think, to overstate not just the popularity, but the pop cultural saturation of The Princess Bride. It has become such a point of reference that it has been absorbed osmotically by now entire generations of people. I know 15-year-olds who can quote this movie verbatim. I know 50-year-olds who can quote this movie verbatim. Everyone in between has grown up watching this movie. I am very curious about the next generation. I'm very curious about 6 and 7-year-olds now. I'm very curious about 10-year-olds now, the theoretical age of the grandson, played by Fred Savage in the movie. I'm curious about whether or not The Princess Bride will continue to be popular. I'm curious about how well it endures. But I'm pretty confident, all things considered, that it is going to hang around for at least another generation before we get the inevitable disappointing remake. I don't want to think about that. I don't want you to think about that. So let's get into our breakdown of the story. Of course, I talked about at the very beginning of this session, in fact, the layers of narrative associated with the book. This is a book written by William Goldman concerning a fictional fairy tale written by the fictional S. Morgenstern and adapted by the broadly fictional Bill Goldman, as we're introduced to him in the beginning of the novel, after a story that is told to him by his father. He roughly and crudely abridges S. Morgenstern's classic to give us the existing Princess Bride that we have today, and we get, well, something similar in the movie, but something that is much more affectionate, something that is much more warm, something that is much more good-hearted. If you go looking for Bill Goldman in this movie adaptation of The Princess Bride, you are not going to find him. Actually, you are going to find him. I do think that Bill Goldman shows up in this movie, and I would argue that Bill Goldman shows up in this movie in the character of Miracle Max. It feels as though Miracle Max is, at least as brought to life by Billy Crystal, that he is representative of many of those darker and more mean-spirited and nihilistic impulses that we associate with Bill Goldman in the book. So the structure of the story breaks into roughly exactly into 4 parts. We get our extended split bipartite prologue, and then we get a surprisingly tight and well-ordered and well-constructed 3-act sequence. We open with the sick grandson, not named in the movie, playing the 1985 baseball video game Hardball right there at the beginning of the movie. I hadn't played Hardball until, gosh, it was much later. It was 1995, 1996, and I only sought it out because I knew that that was the movie that the kid was playing at the beginning of The Princess Bride. It is not a good game, you guys. I'm actually quite a fan of baseball video games. Like, I've played my fair share of RBI. Like, I know baseball video games, and Hardball is not a great one, but God, it looks good right at the beginning of this movie. His mother comes in and warns him that his grandfather, also not named in the movie, grandfather, grandson, that is it. Fred Savage, Peter Falk, we don't get more names than that. That his grandfather is going to visit and the grandson is less than enthused. The grandfather hypes up the book, which was read to him by his father when he was sick, and settles in to read The Princess Bride by S. Morgenstern. That takes 2.5 minutes. It is 2.5 minutes from the opening black frame of this movie, before even our title card, to Peter Falk saying, Chapter 1. That's how long it takes. This is such incredibly efficient and compact storytelling. It's utterly bizarre to me that William Goldman manages to freely adapt, right? Not adapt in content or even necessarily in tone, but certainly in purpose. He manages to adapt that sprawling introductory commentary that runs through the beginning of the Princess Bride novel into this incredibly clean 2.5-minute introduction to the grandfather and grandson characters, also the mother character who will not be appearing in the rest of this film. We then transition into the story itself. This is the second part of the prologue, if you like. This is Buttercup and Wesley falling in love, saying as you wish, having remarkable and undue sexual tension over the passing of a pitcher. It's a pretty hot scene for what was marketed at the time as a kids movie. They kiss by the sunset, the frame breaks. We get, of course, the rising score here, the score written by Mark Knopfler of Dire Straits. This particular piece, Storybook Love, performed by Willie DeVille, the famous theme from The Princess Bride, rising behind them. They get the break to the skeptical grandson wondering if this is or is not a kissing book. Then Wesley heads off to seek his fortune, is murdered by pirates. Murdered by pirates is good. Buttercup determines she will never love again, and the second prologue concludes, and we have been running 5.5 minutes. 5.5 minutes from nothing to the introduction of 2 stories. If I ever hear again that we need 20 minutes in the Hollywood formula, save the cat formula approach to Hollywood storytelling, right? If I hear from a screenwriter or from someone who loves screenplays that we need 20 minutes and the entirety of the first act to introduce our characters, I will quietly refer them to The Princess Bride, where we introduce 4 primary characters in 2 primary stories, and we do so beautifully. 5.5 minutes to get us into our actual story. And when I say our actual story, what do I mean? The Princess Bride is not a structurally perfect movie. It is a little muddied. It is a little... While clear on its own tone and purpose, it is unclear about the natural laws of narrative. We don't have a clearly defined protagonist. Who is the protagonist of this story? Well, Wesley, obviously. He's the guy with the black mask and the sword, except he spends most of the second act dead and is absent from most of the first act and is the protagonist only because we associate the most important named male character with the protagonistic role in fiction. Buttercup actually works better, structurally speaking, as the protagonist of this story. Her decisions generally delineate the turning points between acts and absolutely delineate beautifully, powerfully, the midpoint of the entire piece, which we'll get to in just a moment. So it's not completely tight. We break POV all the time. We do have some intrusion of some tonal difference here as we move through. We don't always balance the drama and the comedy as beautifully as we might like. We don't even always get perfect line delivery. This is kind of critiquing this movie at a very, very high level because, as previously mentioned, I have seen this movie 100 times, and it is only after 100 viewings that certain things about this movie get under my skin. I don't like the repetition of the line, "I would not say such things if I were you." I particularly don't like the way that we deliver it the second time. That's not great. I don't love the way that Wesley lies to Buttercup in the fire swamp, right? When they're embracing after the lightning sand and he sees the ROUSs right there, like, I don't know, maybe the closest one is maybe 12 feet from him, and then they turn around and he says, "Well, I don't believe they exist," which is a great joke that leads to the giant rodent, the rodent of unusual size leaping onto him. Like, that's great, but he does flat out lie to Buttercup. I also don't love "that was a warning, Highness, next time my hand flies on its own for where I come from, there's a penalty when a woman lies." That has not aged well. That has not aged well at all. But if you look at Buttercup as the protagonist of this piece, the structure does emerge in a surprisingly elemental, a surprisingly structurally sound kind of way. Let's move into that. So we've had our split prologue right up front. We've had grandson and grandfather. We've had Buttercup and Wesley. I know that I'm not even talking to the chat tonight. I do apologize for all of that. I did just notice Dry Heaving Llama saying, "Wait, Buttercup is the protagonist?" Yes, I think you can argue that Buttercup is the protagonist, and I will argue that Buttercup is the protagonist because Buttercup's decisions do delineate the turning points in the structure, and that is what differentiates the protagonist from a supporting character, particularly when you're dealing with a story that has a strong romantic element. It is always tempting to look at the hero and heroine as a gestalt protagonistic entity, but stories that rely on that are generally much weaker, and I'm not sure at all that that is true of this story. Wesley is primarily reactive. Buttercup's decisions mark the turning points between the acts. She has control of the structure, and having control of the structure means that you have control of the story, and when you have control of the story, you are the protagonist. That is what the protagonist means. Who is driving the action forward? Well, yes, it is fair to say that Buttercup is reactive, particularly through the first act, arguably through most of the film, but she is at least making key decisions at key moments. I would argue that Buttercup is at least as much the protagonist of this film as Wesley is, and let's get into that argument, in fact. So Wesley has headed off into the wild blue yonder. He has gone to America, which has, this was after America and long after the discovery of fortunes, as we learn from the pages of the book. We learn that Buttercup will never love again. We transition into the story itself. Act 1 picks up 5 years later with the announcement of Prince Humperdinck's bride-to-be, Princess Buttercup. We never get to see the courtship, such as it is. We never get to see the wooing, such as it is. It's just that Buttercup is the most beautiful woman in a century, and thus she is going to marry Prince Humperdinck. Her only solace is in her daily ride, which carries her far from the castle, and ultimately into the company of Vicini, Inigo, and Fezzik, who capture her in an attempt to fabricate a war between Gilder and Florin, and this is our inciting incident. Again, we're really fast here. We're maybe 7 minutes into the movie at this point when we get our inciting incident. The inciting incident for this actual plot, well, okay. You can argue that the inciting incident for this plot is the announcement of the marriage between Humperdinck and Buttercup. You can argue that that is what starts the trouble that will be resolved by the end of the film. But more specifically, I think that you can argue that the arc of the first act is defined by Vicini, Fezzik, and Inigo taking Buttercup and trying to fabricate this war, trying to start this war between Gilder and Florin, a business with a prestigious history, as we learn. Our antagonists take Buttercup on their boat, setting course for the Cliffs of Insanity that border with Gilder, the Gilder frontier, I suppose, pursued, though, by an unknown boat. Buttercup leaps into the water, though she does not get eaten by the eels at this time, as the grandfather reassures the grandson. We break back to the grandfather and the grandson at this point, in fact, in order to establish what will be a recurring theme. The grandson saying, or implicitly saying at this point, you're telling the story wrong, right? The grandfather reassures the grandson, don't worry, she's not going to die now, because the grandson is concerned not just with the mortal danger that is facing Buttercup, but with the subversion of our expectations regarding narrative. The grandson knows how stories should work. And he has already, at his young and tender age, absorbed that knowledge. He can now intuit the shape of a story, as we all can. So that's going to be a recurring theme as we break out to the framing device with Fred Savage and Peter Falk there. So we get the reassurance that she is not going to die at this time. We break back to the grandson and the grandfather. We stress that fictional frame. We come back beautifully skipping around in the timeline a little bit. No, you read that part already. Then we catch up with where we are, and we get the somewhat anticlimactic rescue of Buttercup, I suppose. We arrive at the Cliffs of Insanity. The man in black ascends the rope used by Fezzik, then fences Inigo at the top. We get the introduction of Inigo's backstory, already established by Vicini, that he was drunk, that he was so drunk he couldn't buy brandy, I suppose, is the line that we get back on the boat. And then Inigo gives us, in an absolutely bravura monologue, he gives us the whole backstory of Inigo Montoya and the slaying of his father Domingo at the hands of the six-fingered man. Incidentally, the entire clifftop duel, that entire sequence, which is... Yeah, that's my favorite sequence in the film, actually. I love that sequence more than I love any other sequence in the film. I think it's absolutely knockout. That entire thing is performed by Cary Elwes and Mandy Patinkin, with the exception of two shots. The two shots which are performed by stunt performers are the two shots where Inigo and Wesley, respectively, swing on the little bar, right? Neither Mandy Patinkin nor Cary Elwes did that shot, but literally everything else is performed by the two of them. They spent 3 weeks prior to the start of principal photography learning how to fence both with their right and left hands, which is fantastic, and would apparently spend every spare moment that they had on set when they were filming other material practicing this choreography. And each actor actually learned both halves of the choreography so that Cary Elwes could play Inigo's part in the fencing duel, rather, so that he could anticipate what it was that Mandy Patinkin was going to do and get that kind of that reciprocal trust arrangement in that choreography. It's absolutely stunning. And if you watch it now, you'll see that it looks nothing like fight scenes that are choreographed in modern movies. Because in modern movies, we cut all the damn time. In modern movies, if you go, the Zack Snyder approach or the Michael Bay approach, where you get maybe a quarter of a second shot and then you get a cut, we don't do that in this fight sequence at all. Instead, we rely on the skill of our actors. We rely on the skill of our performers to communicate what is happening, and it is incredible because it's not just, I suppose, the relatively slow pace of the cutting in the sequence. It's not just the relatively slow editing that we get in this sequence. It's also the way that we shoot it. We don't shoot close-ups in the sequence. We are, generally speaking, shooting three-quarter shots or full body shots of both of these actors, and it is an absolute barnstormer of a performance. I have loved this scene. I have told this story recently, but I took this scene to show and tell when I was maybe 11 years old, so maybe 1989. I had maybe just got the VHS and fallen in love with The Princess Bride. I was, 11. Maybe I had just turned 12. Maybe it was like the first week of that new school year, and I brought the videotape of The Princess Bride and showed this sequence for for show and tell, and was utterly unable to articulate what it was that I love about it. But thanks to the skill of my inspiring and brilliant English teacher, hello to Miss Burrows if you ever happen to hear this somewhere out there on the internet, thanks to the inspiration of my English teacher at the time, I was moved to break down why this story was so powerful, what it was about the story, what it was about the movie that really spoke to me. And that, if I can track my own origin story back further than the decision 10 years ago to start podcasting, that is my own origin story, not just with The Princess Bride, but with my love of analyzing stories and seeking beyond my immediate emotional response to figure out how it is that stories do what they do. That may well be the moment that it all started for me. So in a way, we all have Miss Burrows to thank for the existence of these podcasts, I suppose. So we're done with the Inigo fight 25 minutes into the movie. It's already over by that point, which is astonishing. We transition into the Fezzik fight where we test strength as well as skill. I don't love that sequence so much, and partly my problem with that sequence is function is production related, is cinematographic, honestly. Andre the Giant had actually injured his back, so he couldn't carry Elwes around on his back during the sequence that's shot there. So instead, they had to fudge it with shots. So we fudge that sequence with shots in a way that we don't fudge the duel sequence at the top of the Cliffs of Insanity with clever editing and framing. We just don't do that. We don't do that with Inigo Montoya. We do it with Fezzik the Giant, and that's unfortunate, I think. But still, an utterly compelling and very, very swift sequence. So the Man in Black knocks out Fezzik at this point. He continues the pursuit of Buttercup, though here we pause to introduce another narrative thread. Here we bring Humperdinck into the mix. We bring Humperdinck and Count Rugen and all of their many hunters, just men at arms, I suppose. They need an entourage. They need a following here. So we introduce that storyline too. The Man in Black faces Vizzini in a battle of wits. Vizzini tries to deduce into which goblet the Man in Black has poured the iocane powder. Vizzini dies 35 minutes into the movie, and we transition into Act 2, or we kind of transition into Act 2. Where you draw the dividing line between Act 1 and 2 depends on how you see the movie, right? There is an argument that if Wesley is the protagonist of The Princess Bride, then we transition right here. We transition with the death of Vizzini and Buttercup and Wesley being reunited even though Buttercup doesn't know it. I prefer to delay it by a couple more minutes until we get to the top of the ravine. When Buttercup pushes him, he cries out, "As you wish." She realizes what she has done. That, for me, works as a more functional transition into Act 2, but those two scenes are very close together. And either of those, I think, is permissible as a point of inflection between the first and second act, depending on whether you were looking at this as Wesley's movie or Buttercup's movie. So, yes, good. So we transition into Act 2 with Wesley. Spoilers, it's been Wesley the whole time, you guys. The Man in Black, the guy with the mask, Wesley the whole time. He's reunited with Buttercup. He tells her the story of the dread pirate Roberts. She pushes him into the ravine. The truth is revealed. The grandson is impatient with the kissing part. We skip ahead to the fire swamp, facing the dangers through the fire swamp section of the flame spurts, the lightning sand, and the ROUSs before emerging on the far side. In the forest, we are accosted by Humperdinck and Count Rugen, and Buttercup surrenders Wesley into their care. That is the midpoint in the movie. We are now 50 minutes into this 100-minute movie, and that is the midpoint. Buttercup making the decision to surrender Wesley after losing him, declaring that she will never love again, realizing that her love for him has not in fact faded, being reunited with him, and then choosing to give him up. That is the midpoint in the movie. That is the point at which we turn from the first half to the second half of the second act there. I completely love the way this is handled, and I love the performances too. Do you promise not to hurt him? What was that? What was that? A really, really great sequence. And I love too Wesley's interactions with Count Rugen. Apparently, Cary Elwes told Christopher Guest not to pull his punch right at the end of that sequence, and then spent a day in the infirmary, spent a day recovering from the consequence of being punched in the head, and stern words were had by insurance agents on the set, I'm sure. Excuse me. Yes, as Jenna's quoting here, we are men of action, lies do not become us. I absolutely love that line. It's just the greatest thing. It's just so, so fantastic. I am halfway through my time and we are halfway through the movie. Look at how that works out. So we get the reversal of Buttercup's fortunes. That delineates the midpoint in the second act. And then we move into the back half of the second act where our lovers are separated once more. The king dies. The grandson interrupts to complain that the story is not going the way that it should. Queen Buttercup is harangued by a character that I hated when I was watching this movie as a child, and who I have to say, even today, still upsets me quite a lot. This is Ancient Boer, as she is credited in the script and on IMDb. I do not like the Queen of Refuse, the Queen of Filth, the Queen of Putrescence. Boo, boo. I don't like that sequence. I don't like how that sequence makes me feel, and I don't like the way, okay, I appreciate and respect very much that sequence. I, as a viewer of a movie, don't like that sequence. It makes me uncomfortable. I don't like the swimmy way that we come out of it. It's all very, very tough. So it turns out that it was all a dream. You're very smart. Shut up. Humperdinck says that he will send for Wesley, and it is revealed that he and Count Rugen were planning this war with Gilder all along. I love the completely unnecessary intimacy between Humperdinck and Count Rugen as they are approaching the pit of despair. I love that he calls him Tyrone. I love the way that they get along together. There's no need for it. This feels to me, I mean, of course, very, very William Goldman, very Rob Reiner, of course, but also very Christopher Guest, right, who plays Count Rugen. That feels very true to his sensibility. Wesley is tested on the machine. Humperdinck reveals to his spymaster that the plot is afoot, that the thieves' forest needs to be emptied, which moves us into the Inigo plot again. Fezzik and Inigo are reunited. Inigo's vengeance is near, but he needs the Man in Black's help to get into the palace. Humperdinck, unfortunately, kills Wesley out of fury and anger and jealousy and out of the realization that he is not in control of the narrative. More on that later. Inigo is led to the pit of despair. He prays to his father after Fezzik knocks out the mute, played in a really interesting cameo by Mel Smith of the British comedy duo Smith and Jones. He partnered for a long time through the 1980s with Griff Rhys-Jones. He was one of my favorite comedic performers in the 1980s. The first time that I saw The Princess Bride, I recognized him. I recognized him more than I recognized basically any other actor in this entire cast, which was weird for me because it is such an unnecessary little cameo, but I love it a lot. So Inigo finds the pit of despair thanks to his... Well, thanks potentially at least to his father guiding his sword. They find Wesley dead, which leads to another intrusion from the grandson, who is getting more and more frustrated with this story's refusal to obey the rules of narrative. Wesley can't be dead. Who kills Humperdinck at the end? And his grandfather replies honestly, of course, that Humperdinck survives the story. Kind of. Then we're off to Miracle Max, who, as I say, reads to me like the intrusion of Bill Goldman. I like very much how that works out. Turns out that Wesley is only mostly dead. He's resurrected by Max and his wife Valerie in a great, God, just a great turn, just a great sequence. I'm not a witch, I'm your wife. It's so, so good. Wesley returns to life on the ramparts of the castle and marks the transition into the third act of the movie. We are 75 minutes into our 100-minute movie, and we are now ready to get into the action sequence. So to break down this structure, that is a 5-minute paired prologue, 30 minutes for Act 1, 45 minutes for Act 2, 25 minutes for Act 3. That is pretty close to textbook 3-act structure, right? If you remove the prologue, Act 1 and 3 are pretty much the same length, and Act 2 is about 50% longer than either Act 1 or Act 3. That is textbook, classic Aristotelian 3-act structure, and here it is in a movie that feels while you're watching it like it is just a sequence of bits, like it is just a sequence of skits, a sequence of distractions, right? Every sequence in this movie works, some better than others, admittedly, but every sequence in this movie works, and yet when you look at the underlying structure, it is there, it is evident, it is powerful, and it is proof that William Goldman knows what he is doing. And now I need to go and look at the rest of his work. I really have to go and look at the rest of his his screenplay work in particular, I think, because Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid has a 3-act structure that you can bounce a quarter off. That is a locked, tight 3-act structure. That is also true, I think, if I remember correctly, of All the President's Men. Like, there's a lot going on there. I really want to go back and study that series, yeah. Miracles only work with chocolate, says Melissa. Yes, I can imagine. That's very good. Yes, that's why they work against Dementors as well, says Melissa. There you go. Chocolate is the unifying thing, the force which binds us together. Turns out, it's just chocolate. Not midichlorians, George Lucas, just chocolate. So there on the ramparts, as we transition into our third act, we index our strengths and weaknesses. They put together a plan of attack. The wedding ceremony begins as Fezzik plays the part of the dread pirate Roberts. Also going to be very significant later. Inside the castle, Humperdinck forces the end of the ceremony. Inigo confronts Count Rugen. We approach the climax of the movie. Rugen wounds Inigo. He throws the blade. Awful scene. Like beautiful scene. Really tough to watch. I really feel for Inigo through that section. Buttercup faces her own death, which is kind of our dark moment in the Buttercup storyline, right? That she places the dagger to her chest. I mean, there are a shortage of perfect breasts in the world. Would be ashamed to pity a pair such as yours. Then we get I'm losing my track in my notes here. So excited am I to talk about the Princess Bride. Then Inigo defeats Rugen and Wesley defeats Humperdinck, and we move into our happy ever after with the perfect, most passionate kiss ever, and our final epilogue as the grandson asks the grandfather to come back tomorrow and maybe read him the story again. And the grandfather replies, "As you wish." A perfect end to a perfectly constructed movie. What is The Princess Bride about? Well, I completely understand why Paramount had so much trouble marketing this film. I completely get it. Like, how do you... Is this a comedy in the year that Spaceballs came out? Is this a fantasy film? Well, no, it's not. I mean, it's just not. This movie doesn't work on its own terms as a fantasy story. Is it a fairy tale in the year that Cinderella was re-released by the Walt Disney Company? Well, no, it's not that either. Is it a kids' movie? Well... no, and not just because of picture-related sexual tension. It doesn't really work as a kids' movie with great and grand themes of revenge and the constant subversion of the kids' movie version of the story, right? All the way through this film, Fred Savage is pushing back against this film, saying, this is not a kid's story. Is this a kissing book? Who kills Humperdinck at the end? Wesley can't be dead. What are you saying? You're reading it wrong. Like, the way that this movie interrogates its own role as a kids' movie absolutely rejects that categorization. What is it? Well, it's kind of a satire in the broadest and loosest possible sense, but what it really is a paean to the power of storytelling. I have selected here, what have I got? 7, 8 quotes that I have selected from the entirety of the movie. I'm going to read these to you in linear order right now, and I could have pulled another 20, another 30, another 40 quotes, all of which would have spoken to the underlying point. This is true love. You think this happens every day? You were supposed to be the Colossus. You were this great legendary thing, and yet he gains. I swear on the soul of my father, Domingo Montoya, you will reach the top alive. Then he explained the name was the important thing for inspiring the necessary fear. You see, no one would surrender to the dread pirate Wesley. You truly love her, so you might have been truly happy. Not one couple in a century has that chance, no matter what the storybooks say. Your Wesley is dead. I killed him myself. Then why is there fear behind your eyes? Hello, my name is Inigo Montoya. You killed my father. Prepare to die. That is what to the pain means. It means I leave you in anguish, wallowing in freakish misery forever. At every point in this story, we are telling stories about stories. We are telling stories about telling stories. We are telling stories about being the victim of stories. We are telling stories about trying to create and craft stories, about taking control of the narrative. Why does Inigo pursue revenge? Why does the dread pirate Robert spare Wesley? Why does Humperdinck hire Vizzini? Why does Humperdinck kill Wesley in the third act of the story? Why do the guards abandon the gate, or in the second act of the story, I suppose? Why do the guards abandon the gate at the end? How does Wesley defeat Humperdinck? Why does the grandson, right at the end of the movie, want to hear about the kiss? Because stories matter. And whoever controls the story, well, within the fictional frame of The Princess Bride, whoever controls the story controls the story. But it's more than just controlling. It's whoever understands the story. There are laws of narrative at play in the universe of The Princess Bride, which we are given access to not just by the transparent and intuitive mode of narrative that we get from the telling of a story from grandfather to grandson, but because of the constant pressure of the grandson pointing out when the story is not doing what we expect it to do. The happy ever after ending is the realization. It is the unification of all of the narrative potential that is contained within this text. The Princess Bride cares about stories, speaks passionately on the subject of stories, weaves stories, deconstructs and then reconstructs stories better than any other text that I can think of. Now, this is true, of course, of the Goldman original, but in William Goldman's satirical desire to have Bill Goldman satirically abridge S. Morgenstern's original satirical novel, right? The layers of satire strip away all of that narrative purity, I suppose. But that narrative purity, those clear and clean intentions are preserved more fully in the movie version. And it becomes, rather than, in some senses, a snide and incomplete shadow of the thing that it is meant to be, which is what the book gives us. I'm particularly thinking of the discussion of the very end of the book. If you recall our breakdown of the book, right? Right at the end, we get the version of the ending, the happily ever after version, that is given to Bill Goldman within the fictional frame by his father. Then we get the actual S. Morgenstern original, which is the dopey cliffhanger, dopey satirical cliffhanger ending, right? The nothing is resolved, things are looking grim. Will our heroes escape? Join us next time for a book that will never be written. And then we get the modern, tired, cynical, nihilistic Bill Goldman version of the finale, of the conclusion to the story. The movie rejects all of that. The movie finds purity in the ending, not just in the kiss, but in the grandson's desire to hear about the kiss, and then most fully in Peter Falk standing in the doorway saying, "As you wish." This movie has one of the most powerful endings that I have ever seen, and it is powerful not just because it's a sappy moment between grandfather and grandson, not just because it's a callback to the very beginning of the movie, hey, remember when Wesley used to say, "As you wish," isn't that cool? But because it completely understands what this film is for, what this story is doing. If you watch The Princess Bride again with an eye for stories and storytelling, I'm not kidding you guys, you are going to see this everywhere. You are going to see it everywhere. When Buttercup gives up in the fire swamp and says that they're going to die, Wesley tells her a story. He tells it, no, we've already succeeded. Here is the story of how we succeeded. What are the 3 dangers of the fire swamp? The flame spurts, well, they make a popping sound before they go off. We can easily avoid that. The lightning sound, you were clever enough to discover what that looks like, so we can avoid that in the future too. The ROUSs, I don't believe they exist. He is telling her a story of their victory over the fire swamp while they are still in the mire of the fire swamp. They're still right there, caught in the danger, and he knows that because he's looking an ROUS in the eye as he says it. It's brilliantly constructed. This is a film that doesn't just love stories, but understand stories. And crucially, doesn't just understand stories, but love stories too. It works on both levels. It is passionate and positive and pure, but also self-aware and analytical and open to interpretation and open to debate and conflict and contrast within the narrative frame. This is my Patronus, effectively, right? This is what I seek to do in all the work that I conduct here on the internet, in all of the live sessions that I have ever done, in all of the classes I have ever taught, in all of the podcasts I have ever produced. This is what I seek to do. It is positive and pure and loving, and it is smart, and it is insightful, and it is self-aware. Now, clear, I am not saying that I managed to rise to the level of The Princess Bride, that I have ever managed to rise to the level of The Princess Bride, but you don't have to. You know, that's not what a Patronus is for. A Patronus is to remind you that, I suppose to crib from Robert Browning, that your reach should exceed your grasp. But this is my compass. This is my North Star. This is what leads me in the work that I do, and I hope that it leads you too. I hope that it inspires you equally. My gosh, you guys, we still have a few minutes to go. Let's take some questions, I guess. Do you have some questions? I mean, I can talk about this movie. We can break down individual scenes if you have any individual scenes you want to talk about, if you just want to share your favorite quotes. Let's, well, we have some questions. Let's take a look at our polls here. Yep, completely right. So let me do this in reverse order. Our favorite characters are equally Vizzini and the grandfather. The grandson, interestingly, getting zero votes. No love for Fred Savage here, which I'm very sad to see. 1 vote each for the grandfather and for Vizzini. 2 votes for Valerie and for Fezzik and for Wesley. 3 votes for Miracle Max, which is way higher than I would have expected. And of course, 7 votes for Hello, my name is Inigo Montoya. Absolutely my favorite character, absolutely my favorite performance. And this is a movie where I don't think any of the performers put a foot wrong. Andre the Giant is obviously like a sticking point. I know there are many people out there who just cannot parse what it is that Fezzik is saying. His accent is so thick and his delivery is so forced. Andre the Giant is not... Well, okay, I was going to say was not an actor, but that's not actually fair because, of course, he was a professional wrestler for much of his career. So he was an actor, but he was a physical actor more than he was a deliverer of acute William Goldman dialogue. I know that there are many people out there who struggle with Fezzik's delivery, but I love all of the performances in this film. Mandy Patinkin does it for me. He's so strong. Inigo is so great, such a brilliant character. And, of course, that final... He also gets a couple of cuts. I was talking right at the beginning of tonight's session about the changes that William Goldman makes to the dialogue. In 2 points, William Goldman, the adapter of the movie, does what Bill Goldman, the abridger of the S. Morgenstern original, should have done. He abridges. He cuts. When Wesley is climbing the cliffs of insanity in the book, and Inigo gives him the "I swear on the soul of my father, Domingo Montoya, you will reach the top alive," we then get a response from Wesley, which is something like, "I do not know this Domingo Montoya of whom you speak, but I hear in your tone of voice that..." No, "throw me the rope" is the right answer. Good job. Cut that out. Make it spare. Make it stark. Make it emotionally punchy. That is a great, great transition. And then, of course, when Inigo is fighting Count Rogan at the end, making "I want my father back, you son of a bitch" the last line in that exchange, which it is not in the book. In the book, we get a couple more lines, but in the movie, that is the final exchange between the two of them. And God, it is perfect. It is perfect. Mandy Patinkin's physicality throughout is just utterly, utterly extraordinary. The second poll question that I asked was, do you prefer the movie or the book version of The Princess Bride? One person says, I love them the same. 3 people say the book, and 14 people say the movie. That is actually, yeah, pretty consistent. That is pretty consistent. I am surprised, in fact, that one person says I love them the same. I'm surprised that one person is as on the fence as I am. Thank you, person who said that. I do love them. Well, okay, I don't love them the same. The book is not formative to my experience of narrative and my sense of identity and my role in the world, my professional career, in the way that the movie is. But I do respect the book at least as much as I respect the movie, but in very different ways. The purpose, the underlying purpose of the book is fundamentally different, and the tone of the book is fundamentally different. What I mentioned earlier, I was actually paraphrasing a weird confluence of things, I suppose. In the last session, I paraphrased the words of Captain Jean-Luc Picard in Star Trek First Contact. What Hamlet said with irony, I say with sincerity, what a piece of work is man, right? That's a great exchange in First Contact, and I basically cribbed that in the last session without realizing consciously that I was quoting him, and it was only after I listened back to that session that I was like, oh yeah, wait, that's Captain Picard's line. That's so good. That also is the difference between the book and the movie here. The book is ironic about the virtues of fairy tales and at one remove is cynical and is somewhat caustic about that great virtue of restoration and of consolation that is offered us by great fairy tales. And the movie brilliantly is not. The movie plays it completely straight and delivers exactly that emotional resonance that we're looking for at the end of the story. Let's take a look at these questions, shall we? Just before we wrap up. Oh, I'm just looking now. For some reason, that loaded in reverse order, which is weird. But Rayla Lynn says, have you read As You Wish? What is your favorite behind-the-scenes story? Mine is that in order to generate chemistry between them, Cary Elwes made it his mission to make Robin Wright laugh at least once a day, or drunk Andre the Giant falling asleep in the hotel lobby and the maids having to vacuum around him in the morning. I am, as of this moment, halfway through Cary Elwes's brilliant As You Wish, the inconceivable story of the production of The Princess Bride. I forget exactly how it's phrased on the cover. It is really great. I'm listening to the audiobook version, and it is an absolute knockout. I was going to make sure that I had listened to the whole thing before giving this one shot, but it turns out that this is not the last time that we're going to be talking about The Princess Bride. I have not yet been able to find a place on my schedule for this, but at some point within the next 2 weeks, we are all going to watch The Princess Bride together, or at least you guys are all cordially invited. I make no demands of you in your free time. You are cordially invited to watch The Princess Bride with me. Over on YouTube, in fact, we're going to kick the tires on YouTube's new chat system and their new low latency system, which would mean that there is less delay between my live video and you seeing that live video on your computers or tablets or phones or whatever. So stay tuned. We're going to have an opportunity to watch the movie together and just celebrate it, I guess. And I will have finished As You Wish by that point. I'm really, really enjoying it. I've also had the opportunity to watch Cary Elwes give a couple of interviews from the late 1990s up to the present day in the course of the last couple of days, just little YouTube clips of interviews. And I like him a great deal, I have to say. When I was a kid, he was defined for me by 2 performances, The Princess Bride on the one hand and Robin Hood Men in Tights on the other. Well, God, I'm really hesitant. I'm not going to lie. I find that the Mel Brooks stuff has not aged well for me, or that I have not aged well for the Mel Brooks stuff. One of those 2 things is true. I do now kind of want to revisit Men in Tights and see how that holds up. But I like Cary Elwes a great deal, and he's always a pleasure when he shows up in things. And a very smart man, a very, very capable communicator, a very insightful and human individual, I think. He has a great deal of empathy that I like a lot. Okay, let me see here. Jenna asks, hey, I know I wasn't here for the discussion of the book, but Goldman's jokes about Morgenstern's long-windedness are definitely aimed at Tolkien, right? Or am I just too deep in there and back again? Less specifically aimed at Tolkien than at writers in the Tolkienian mode. Like at Tolkien, yes. At just Tolkien, no. By the time that Goldman wrote this book in 1973, by the time that Goldman graduated from Columbia in the middle of the 1950s in 1956, if memory serves, Tolkien's influence after the publication of The Hobbit had already, taken root with an entire generation of fantasy writers and modern fairy tale storytellers. Modern fairy tales at that point had turned into, with the exception of Walt Disney, right, who's out on the fringes telling somewhat bowdlerized fairy tale fiction for an all-ages audience, fairy tales in the novel form had turned into Tolkien-inflected fantasy stories. And yes, Goldman is absolutely poking fun, not necessarily at the professor himself, but not at the professor himself, right? Absolutely at The Hobbit, absolutely at The Lord of the Rings, and absolutely at the host of imitators who rose in the wake of The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. The kind of the two generations that Tolkien inspired, remembering that there was 20 years between the publication of The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. Of course, an entire generation of people had come up and started writing stories in the mode of The Hobbit, in the much more fairy tale fantasist mode of The Hobbit. And then, of course, when Tolkien publishes The Lord of the Rings, many of those writers pivot and a whole new generation comes up writing faux histories, writing these incredibly dense and impenetrable and profound treatises on things of that ilk. I also think that one of the points of inspiration for real life William Goldman's depiction of the works of S. Morgenstern is the quasi-fantastical, certainly satirical, gazetteer, journey novels of the 17th and 18th centuries. I'm thinking, of Swift here. I'm thinking of Gulliver's Travels in this regard. He's also clearly drawing out the tension between satire and narrative. Satire and narrative sit oftentimes uncomfortably together because satire is not a narrative goal. Satire is a meta-narrative goal, right? You cannot read a story and go, oh, that was a good satire, without a knowledge of the subject of the satire, right? It works in a very similar way to allegory. I guess it works in exactly the inverse way to allegory, in fact. It is in many ways the narrative reflection of allegory, in that in allegory, the story resolves into the referent, whereas in satire, the referent is a prerequisite for appreciating the story. These two things are interdependent in a way that pure narrative is not. So I think that he's definitely looking at Swift in that regard too. But beyond that, I don't know that there's really an accounting of what inspired William Goldman to write this. As I mentioned in the last session, William Goldman actually both told Princess Bride stories to his daughters when they were growing up, and then sat down to start to write The Princess Bride, right? The original draft of The Princess Bride is completely straight. It is just a fairy tale. The intrusions that take place within the fictional frame, within the S. Morgenstern frame of the novel, are actually the original William Goldman intrusions when he was trying to be a little bit snarky and a little bit satirical about the content. He doesn't have any success with that book. He writes the entirety of the first chapter, gets 4 pages into the second chapter, hits a wall hard, and only continues the book when he has this epiphanic moment, when he realizes that what the book needs is the frame, and then he writes it very, very quickly indeed. Reading about William Goldman's process is enormously frustrating because he swings so hard from writing incredibly quickly and writing incredibly slowly. There is nowhere in between for William Goldman, which I find utterly, utterly fascinating. Mitchell asks, do you think that part of the reason that they introduce characters so fast is due to the fairy tale framework and narrative, though? Yes, I think that's fair for Buttercup and Wesley, certainly. I think Buttercup is the most beautiful woman who lives in the world, and Wesley is the farm boy that she realizes that she loves, who has loved her all along. Yes, and of course, movies can be so much more efficient than novels because we're not just dependent on the written word. We're dependent on the visuals and the performances and the music and the editing and the pacing and the color correction and color treatment that we give to the film. Like every discrete element of the movie is capable of bearing a narrative weight. And I would argue that in the split prologues that we get, every element bears a narrative weight. Part of the reason that we are so quickly introduced to the grandson and the grandfather, why we get this sense of them, is every editing choice, every framing choice, every prop that is in Fred Savage's bedroom, the moment when the mother opens the curtains and we see the skyline beyond, that carries narrative weight. We start to oh no, this is suburbia. Okay, I know who this kid is. I've seen him in other movies. I know what's up. every decision contributes to our rapid engagement with these characters. And that, to be clear, is very difficult to do. Movies are enormously collaborative. So while we might credit Rob Reiner with the success of The Princess Bride, or we might credit William Goldman with the success of The Princess Bride, or we might credit Cary Elwes with the success of The Princess Bride, none of these individuals are solely responsible for this movie working. There are 1987, a Paramount production that cost $16 million, probably 400 people who touched this film, probably 400 people, cast, crew, editors, musicians, everyone who touched this film contributed to its efficacy, contributed to its emotional and narrative impact. Film is incredibly collaborative. Film is the most collaborative medium, right? And nobody works in concert as well as filmmakers because you have to, which is one of the reasons I think that film is generally recognized as a director's medium. Film is generally recognized as the domain of the auteur director because that singular vision is absolutely necessary in order to unify all of these creative contributions into something whole and into something complete. Yes, everyone, just like Black Sails, says Angela. Black Sails, you say? Don't think I've heard. Oh, is that the pirate show? Yeah, I've heard some things about that. Black Sails, for those of you who are joining me for this one shot and perhaps haven't seen that show or heard me talk about that show previously, Black Sails is one of the most extraordinary things on television and is also incredibly narratively dense, from the showrunners to the writers to the episode directors to the cast to the crew to the smallest prop in the smallest shot in the most incidental episode. There is such a depth of commitment and of passion there that I absolutely love. And as Princess Bride was shot on location in England, mostly, and the final shots, I think the framing sequence, I believe, was done at Shepperton, right? There were a couple shots where we're obviously out in the British countryside, and there were a couple of shots where we were obviously on a soundstage. I think the soundstages were all at Shepperton. I know that the framing device, I believe I should say, that the framing device was entirely shot at Shepperton too. But while the cast and the crew were on location, Rob Reiner would host dinner parties, and he would invite the cast and the crew over to his house, to the house that he had rented in England for the duration of the shoot, in order to have dinner together and watch movies together and laugh and talk and walk the garden together and all of these things, deliberately trying to foster this feeling of family that comes through in the movie, of course, between our principal actors and performers, but also through, I think, the dedication of the crew to creating this wonderful film. I've barely had an opportunity to talk to about the soundtrack to this film and Mark Knopfler and his ability to draw together the modern and the mythic. I am a fair fan of Dire Straits, not perhaps the hugest fan of Dire Straits. I would absolutely credit the Making Movies album as being somewhat formative for me. I think that's a knockout album, but apart from that, I'm not, terribly into Dire Straits, but I do love the work that Mark Knopfler has done. It also has that incredibly distinctive sound, right? I remember getting compilations of movie music or of movie and TV soundtrack pieces back in the mid-1990s, and you could guarantee that two things would be on it: Storybook Love by Mark Knopfler, arranged for The Princess Bride, and the Badalamenti score for Twin Peaks, which was everywhere in the mid-1990s before we suddenly realized, oh no, wait, this is so bad that it is almost sarcastically bad. That's the problem with the Twin Peaks score. You guys, never mind. All right, let's keep pushing on. Oh, Dry Heaving Llama saying the film's soundtrack was disappointing. The fencing scene was particularly bad. The fencing scene music, I see what you're saying, Dry Heaving Llamas, right? The score in the fencing scene is so bombastic that it does push back against the reality of the film a little bit, and it's compounded, I think, by the obvious, the setness, the soundstageness. There's the sequence where Inigo and Fezzik are walking toward the edge of the cliff to look down to see if the man in black has fallen, right before we get Fezzik's great line, "He has very good arms," where they're walking toward the edge of the cliff and you can see the cliff bowing under their weight, because this has obviously been constructed out of like 4x4 and MDF right here on the edge of the soundstage. It's not great, is the thing. And the artificiality of that, I think, could theoretically detract from the intensity and the impact of the sequence, but I like the point of reference is the thing. What we're doing throughout that sequence is referencing Errol Flynn, right? Cary Elwes was cast in part because he has, the reason that Wesley has that mustache throughout the back 2/3 of the story, I suppose, is because we're channeling Errol Flynn there to a certain degree, right? We get that repeatedly as we move through the story. So yeah, I get it, but I see what you're saying. Let me see here. I love the fencing music, says Kate. That's great. Good. Jenna also defending the fencing scene music. Well, this is the thing, right? It is bombastic. It is different from the score in the rest of the film. Most of the score in the rest of the film, but it is distinctive within the film, but it is also making a point. It is itself calling upon a referent. You guys, I am pained to say that we're done. That's it. That's our discussion of The Princess Bride movie for now. We are going to get together next week sometime. Stay tuned to Point North Media for further updates about that, I suppose. But we will get together for this live commentary track. If you haven't joined me for the live commentary track before, you will need your own copy of the movie. I can't stream the movie for legal reasons, but I will basically sit in a little YouTube window and talk, as I'm talking now, over the entirety of the film. The 1 hour, 37 minute running time of this movie, I guess basically 100 minutes of film. I'll talk all over it and you guys can chat in the chat and we'll all have a good time together. It'll be pretty fun. I've done a couple of these live commentaries now and they're surprisingly fun and surprisingly popular too, which is pretty great. So stay tuned for further instructions with regard to The Princess Bride. Also, stay tuned for further news about our next one-shot here from Point North. This has been an absolute pleasure. It has been an honor and a privilege to talk about both the book and the movie. I'm so pleased with all of the many discussions that I've had about The Princess Bride over the course of the last couple of weeks, and I want to have many more, so get in touch with me. You can email pointnorthmedia@gmail.com, or you can head on over to the Point North Media forum, pointnorthmedia.com/forum. That is going to do it. I am going to go off and just kind of bask in the wonder of The Princess Bride. I'm not ruling out the possibility that I might watch it again this evening before bed. I'm not promising that I will, but I may well at least go and watch the fencing scene and then maybe the ending too. Thank you all so much for joining me. Thank you all so much for your contributions through this chat. I will talk